back to the second part of today's workshop. I'm going to briefly present the second speaker of today, David Collins. So David Collins is a fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge University. His work centers on the intersection of virtue ethics with aesthetics, with a special focus on R.G. Collingwood's theory of art. His broader philosophical interests bridge the artificial divides between analytical and continental approaches, engaging with different traditions from pragmatism to phenomenology. I hope that's an accurate description. You have the word.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Peter. And again, as you guys said, thanks for arranging this workshop and inviting us. So everyone, or not everyone, but you commonly hear people say that what they're going to present is a work in progress, and then they present something that's impeccably worked out. It seems a bit dishonest, but what I'm going to present today is genuinely a work in progress. So first time I'm articulating and presenting some of these ideas for feedback, although they do build on some of the themes that I've worked on and presented on previously in Iris and Vitor will probably recognize this somewhat. The project that these ideas are part of is broad and ambitious. What I want to do is offer a unified theory of what art is and why it's valuable. Unified in the sense that artistic value, or what it is for an artwork to be good qua art, and what we distinguish as the value of art, that is why art is valuable or important to create and engage with, are both explained by the answer that's given to the ontological question of what art is. So it's a much broader 3 or 4 year project that this is the start of, in a sense. And because the idea of a spoiler doesn't really apply in philosophy, I'll summarize my conclusion up front and say that I think that art can be plausibly defined as the development and the expression or articulation in a medium of a perspective. That is a way of feeling, understanding, perceiving, experiencing, or otherwise taking things in the broadest sense. And I think that it's art's capacity for making these new perspectives available to others, to readers, spectators, audiences, and so on, that most plausibly grounds the distinctive kinds of cognitive, cultural, political, and even moral value that are often attributed to art. So most of my talk will involve unpacking and explaining all of that. But first I should say something about the motivation for the project and why I think it's justified. So the search for a definition of art might seem to be out of date, or at least it's fallen out of favor in recent analytic aesthetics. I think this is a mistake, and that trying to understand the nature of art and what distinguishes works of art from artifacts and other types of objects that are not art is one of the central issues of aesthetics. For one thing, any theory of the value of art or art's relation to morality and politics will need to be grounded in some idea of what art is. And even investigations into specific issues with individual art forms, such as questions of pictorial depiction or the nature of fiction or musical expression, to name a few examples, need to be able to say why these concerns are with these dimensions of pictures, novels, or songs as types of artworks in order to justify including them under the umbrella of philosophy of art, rather than counting them just as inquiries in the philosophy of perception or metaphysics or epistemology and so forth. So that ties very well with Iris's talk. And without attempts to offer a substantive account of art, we're left with what I've called a merely nominal sense of art, according to which we take anything that is commonly just called art to be a suitable object for our inquiries. But I would argue that the group of everything that might get called art by someone or another is not a stable basis on which to ground theories of, say, art's value, or around which to group certain metaphysical or epistemological or psychological inquiries and call them philosophy of art. So I think there's a need for a theory of art that goes beyond the nominal sense of the term, and one that can explain the distinctions that often get drawn within traditional paradigmatic artistic media or art forms between works in these media that are artworks and works that are not. Here we might think of the commonplace distinction that get made between what some people call art films versus popcorn movies. I don't know if that term is used, but hopefully the idea behind it is familiar. Or between literary works and the kind of page turner that one might buy in an airport to kill time with on the flight. We can think of examples of similar distinctions in other art forms, right? It's plausible that not every thing that counts as a painting is a work of art in the medium of painting. Not every bit of language that counts as a poem is really a work of art. I'll quickly add that I don't think these distinctions are always distinctions between good and bad works in these media, or that the highbrow and lowbrow distinction is particularly useful to explain. Although I'm not going to have time today to say more about why, and that's not really the purpose of this talk. Part of my motivation for the project comes from my experience in film and theater, and to a lesser extent writing poetry and short stories before coming to philosophy, where I was concerned when I was sort of more engaged in art directly with the question, what makes a work in these mediums art as opposed to mere entertainment? And also the question of whether the things I was doing were art, where these weren't questions of the value of what I was doing. Like by asking that or thinking that, I wasn't wondering, is what I'm making a good film, say? So much as I think they were questions of kind, like what kind of thing am I making? And where these questions also occurred, not just to me, but in some form or other, to people I knew working in various art forms, and people I've talked to since who were involved in the arts. And so thinking along these lines isn't something peculiar about me. None of the current theories of art, or attempts to define art, that I found when I came to philosophy looking for answers, offered much that would help answer the questions that I had. Where most theories nowadays are broadly institutional in spirit, in the sense of the institutional theory of art, hopefully you're familiar with that, in that they tend to assume that every artifact created in a traditional art form or artistic media, such as painting, music, literature, and so on, just are our works, because they're works in these media, at least if they're made to be perceived and enjoyed, and not made for a practical purpose. So this leads to one. Oh yeah, I guess I didn't actually start by summarizing the different sections, but that's not that important. So this leads to one desideratum that I take to hold for any theory or definition of art, which is that it should aim to answer the question, what is art, or what makes something a work of art, as the question would arise for people creating or engaging with potential artworks, and not just as the question might arise for someone coming to art from a background in philosophy, how it would arise for what we might call a mere metaphysician. There are three other desiderata that I would add, based both on my own experience in the arts and what I would think are common intuitions, or at least I think these things will seem plausible, which are that whatever a work of art ends up being defined as, it should be something that is created by its maker or makers, with artists being people who bring new things into the world. And it should be something that is or can be experienced by its audience, in a broad sense of experience that isn't necessarily perceptual. The third one is that, again, whatever works of art end up being defined as, they must be at least candidates for bearing the kinds of value that often get attributed to art, although not all works will necessarily have positive value of these kinds. And I think that any definition of art should respect what Moritz Weitz called the open nature, the open logic of the concept of art, such that the definition allows for creativity and novelty in how art is made and in what can count as an artwork, rather than, say, giving necessary and sufficient conditions that put limits on artists' practical or real-life abilities to sort of expand what counts as art. So now that I've set the stage for what I'm doing and considered some methodological points, we can turn to outlining the specifics of the theory that I want to propose. So before explaining what I think perspectives are, how I'm sort of defining and conceiving of that term, as what artworks essentially and uniquely express or articulate, I think it would be good to say how I got to this idea of perspective. So I've said that coming to philosophy of art from a background studying, making, and teaching in the arts, I was generally dissatisfied with recent attempts to define art. Although they've largely been out of favor for several decades, the older theories of art that seemed the most plausible to me and seemed to get the most right, or best map onto the phenomenon of art, and the practices of creating engaging input based on my experience were expression-based theories. And it may not be a coincidence that many of the thinkers who advocated an understanding of art for which expression is central have themselves been artists, such as Wordsworth and Tolstoy, or they've been philosophers who have had some personal experience of art in one or more media, such as Collingwood. And for Merleau-Ponty, it's debatable how much direct engagement he had with art. But apparently he really liked to dance and was an engaged dancer, so maybe that counts. However, older traditional romantic expression-based theories especially face some famous problems. So for one thing, theories that take what is expressed to be the artist's own emotion, whether this is something that's felt when the work is created, as for Tolstoy, or something that the artist felt at some moment in their life, which they then recall and reflect on later when they're making the work, as for Wordsworth. These theories face counterexamples of works where it's just not plausible that the creator felt the emotion the work expresses either at the time of its creation, especially for works that it created over a long time, such as novels or symphonies, and requiring that any emotion expressed in a work be something that the artist has actually felt themselves at some point, I think restricts artists' abilities to creatively portray the emotional experiences of fictional characters or persona unlike themselves. So for example, the middle-aged male resignation to loneliness expressed by the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock was not necessarily, or even plausibly, something that T.S. Eliot himself apparently felt while writing the poem. And while he may have felt this himself on some other occasion, it's not clear why he necessarily should have, as opposed to him imagining how it would or might feel to be of the mindset and in the position of that poem's narrator. For another thing, older expression theories tend to be framed around the expression of feelings or emotions, which seems unnecessarily limiting, since there are some works of art that possibly count as art, that seem not to have any emotional component to them and don't seem expressive in this sense. So here we might think of the abstract geometrical paintings of Mondrian, or in music, the minimal serialist compositions of Steve Reich, or perhaps more controversially with respect to whether it should count as art, conceptual artworks, like Robert Barry's All the Things I Know But Which I Am Not at the Moment Thinking, 1:36 p.m., June 15, 1969. The artwork here is basically just his declaration of this. You might say that it's the concept of this that had to be conveyed through words. I mean, he could have stood in the room and said it, he wrote it down for people to read, but you might think that the work is the idea rather than the specific words put down on a piece of paper or whatnot. So traditional expression theories of art, focusing on, again, emotion and feeling, couldn't really account for works of these that, before we get to a definition, I think at least plausibly should be things that at least might be art or might be covered by the definition. A third problem is that traditional expression theories are hard to square with the requirement that artworks are things that are created by artists in a robust sense of bringing something genuinely new into the world, rather than just making or crafting something or sort of rearranging existing matter. For the 19th century Romantic expression theorists, in which the emotion that's expressed is taken to exist in the artist's psyche or mind, before being externalized in paint, stone, words, sound, or whatever, the artist can't really be said to be creating the emotion. They've already felt it, they're not responsible for it. What they might be thought to create here is the form of the externalization of the work in which the emotion is expressed. So the particular choice and arrangement of words in a poem, for example, the selection and arrangement of colors on a canvas, or of sounds played in a musical composition, and so on. But this risks either making creation far too common and so trivial, because nearly every sentence that everyone says in everyday conversation would then count as bringing a new arrangement of words into being. Or, on the other hand, it would risk making genuine works of art too rare, by requiring something to be radically innovative with respect to how its medium is being used by its maker in order just to count as art. What I've called the post-romantic understanding of expression as found in 20th century thinkers like Dewey, Collingwood, and Merleau-Ponty, do avoid this problem somewhat, since on this conception, and I think this is the basic difference between what I've differentiated as 19th century romantic and post-romantic conceptions of expression. The basic difference is that here, what is expressed is held to be brought into being through the process of the artists working in and with their medium, rather than existing in some form before the work is made. However, these expression theories can still be too focused on something like a feeling or emotion being what's expressed, so that it can be hard to apply to cases like the Mondrian painting or other seemingly emotionless works. Although, to be fair, Collingwood uses the term feeling more broadly than its typical use, to include any sensory or affective impression that's registered at a preconscious level of awareness. And so this would include something like what a particular object or scene looks like at a purely qualitative level, as much as it would include feelings like joy or anger or sadness or so on. And this is general broadening of what kinds of thing can be expressed by art beyond emotions as commonly understood, and the broadening of the idea of what is expressed being created or brought into being through the artist's engagement and interaction with their medium that we find in post-romantic expression theorists like Collingwood or Merleau-Ponty. I think that this is on the right track, and so it's the starting point, or one of the starting points, for what I want to develop further in the account of art that I'm going to be working on. So my proposal is that we think of artworks as essentially expressing not just specific emotions or ideas or qualitative sensations, but ways of feeling, thinking, understanding, perceiving, and so forth. Most broadly, ways of experiencing the world, or some part of it, or what we might just call ways of taking things. So I think that perspective is the best, most general term for what I mean by a way of taking things, but not in the literal sense of a spatial point of view, or at least not primarily, since I do think that this literal sense of perspective is something that artworks can express or articulate. For example, the linear perspective of a Renaissance painting, with a horizon line and shapes arranged around one or more vanishing points. These will articulate different ways of not just conceiving but visually experiencing space, different ways than how, say, adding more vanishing points. So the bottom example, you can't really see it on this slide. It's sort of like an overhead view looking down on a city with skyscrapers and things. So that's an example of three-point perspective, whereas the top example, I'm sure, is quite familiar to people as one-point perspective, because there's one vanishing point to which lines converge within the image. And so not only do these sort of give a different sense of how we might experience space visually, but the multi-point or scattered perspective in a classical Chinese painting, for example, organizes space in even another different way. So it gives us another way of sort of visually organizing or taking space. So I do want the notion of perspective that I'm working with to apply to the literal sense of perspective in visual art, so literal spatial perspective. But I also want to apply to perspectives in the sense that we might speak of someone's perspective on an issue or topic, or we might call this a cognitive perspective, where a way of feeling about something might be called an emotional perspective, and so on. So what's common, I think, between these different kinds of perspectives, visual or spatial, as well as cognitive or emotional, is that they're all ways of organizing or structuring the contents of experience in a way that makes that experience meaningful or significant. This is perhaps most clear in the visual sense, where perspective here involves seeing objects as standing in a spatial relation to each other, both at the two-dimensional level of the picture plane or surface of the image. For example, the different areas of the canvas that shapes or colors occupy, and at the level of the three-dimensional space depicted by and seen in the picture, with different shapes or objects occupying the foreground, middle ground, and background, and so on. In the cognitive sense of having a perspective on some topic or issue, on the US election, for example, which is timely, this is a matter of putting thoughts, observations, knowledge, and so forth about that topic into relation in a certain way. For instance, two people with different perspectives on which presidential candidate should win might have the same data sets, in that they may both have the same knowledge of what each candidate has done in their times in office, what they've done and said during a campaign, the same facts about the US economy or crime rates or whatever, with the difference in their perspectives being made by their counting different factors as having different degrees of relevance or importance. Speaking metaphorically, we might even say that they have different pictures, again, metaphor of the two candidates, even though these pictures are built from the same basic factor elements. And in the case of an emotional perspective, or a way of feeling about something, this is also a matter of treating certain properties of an object, or certain aspects of the situation, as more or less salient or significant than others. So for an example here, consider how the same dog could be experienced from two different emotional perspectives. One in which the dog is an object of joy, and one in which the dog is an object of fear. So clearly, two people experiencing the dog in each of these two ways would be emphasizing different features of the dog. In the fearful perspective, the sight of the dog's teeth or the sound of its barking might be more prominent or hold more weight. Whereas in the joyful perspective, the softness of its fur and an awareness of its wagging tail might be more prominent. And here, I don't think this is simply a matter of thinking or inferring some properties or features of an object or situation are more important than others. Especially in the emotional case, this can literally change the way something is perceived or how it shows up to someone in experience. The dog's teeth might actually, in a subjective sense, look bigger to the person who's experiencing the dog as an object of fear, whereas its fur might look softer, again in a subjective sense, to the person who's experiencing the dog more favorably. So a perspective as a way of taking something can be broadly defined, or at least this is sort of the first pass at a definition, as a way of structuring or organizing the experience of that thing, where the way that the experience of a thing is structured or organized will have an effect on the meaning or significance the experience has, based on which elements are made prominent or foregrounded, and which are de-emphasized or placed in the background. There's a resonance here with the phenomenological tradition, especially with Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, in the talk of foregrounds and backgrounds of an experiential or an intentional field. Where, just for people who may not be aware, I'm using intentional in the phenomenological sense of intentionality, where every experience or moment of consciousness involves what's called an intentional object and an act of consciousness that intends it, so to speak. So this is, maybe you're all familiar with this, but in case even one person isn't, this is a different use of or sense of the word intention from the more common sense to mean meaning to do something, like I intend to finish the talk, which I do. Another connection with phenomenology here is that the distinction I'm drawing between what an artwork takes a perspective on, so we might call it subject matter or content, perhaps, and the perspective itself, or how the artwork takes whatever its content is. This has parallels in the distinction that Husserl drew between what he called the noema and the noesis, that together make up every intentional act for consciousness. Where in his terms, the noema is the intentional object of the act, and the noesis is the nature of the act that intends the object. So in effect, what I'm calling perspective is this noetic side of the intentionality involved in an artwork, where this is ultimately an intentional act of the artist that made the work, that's then reenacted by the audience when apprehending that work as the work that it is. That is, apprehending it as the result of what the artist did. However, I don't want to commit myself to following Husserl exactly on this. So not everything that Husserl said about the structure of intentionality or about the noetic side of intentionality is necessarily going to apply to what I'm calling perspective. I just think that there are some interesting parallels between, the distinction I'm making between what a work of art is showing and how it's showing it, very broadly speaking, and what an active consciousness is intending and how it's intending it in that act. But the payoff of all that is that I'm using the word perspective to mean a way of structuring an experience that makes it meaningful or significant in some way. And so this means that the individual elements that make up the experience will cohere or hang together in a certain way. In one way, in one perspective, and in a different way, in another perspective. The elements of an experience, these could be qualities or properties, or they could be objects in relation to one another and the relation between them. So for instance, one perspective of two things in a certain relation might be seeing an object on top of another as weighing down on it. Or we might see the same pair of objects arranged in the same way, in terms of the bottom object holding up or supporting the one that's above it. And so this would be a way of switching perspectives. This idea of an overall or holistic experience being made up of components of this sort, which are brought together by the mind or subject or consciousness that has the experience, is of course found in, and possibly starts with, Kant, and his idea of a synthesis of a perceptual manifold. And it's also found in the classical American pragmatists, particularly James and Dewey, who were building on Kant, of course, in ways that are broadly in line with what I'm thinking of here. Especially Dewey's notion in his aesthetics of what he calls an experience having qualitative meaning. The meaningfulness or significance of an experience, as it's structured by a particular perspective, isn't necessarily going to be stateable in language or propositional form. So that is, it's not a matter of what we might call semantic meaning or linguistic meaning. Instead, the meaning, or if we want to reserve the word meaning for semantic meaning, the meaningfulness of a work often can only be fully grasped in the qualitative or sensory affective experience of that work, and not by trying to rise above the messy qualitative experiential level by jumping right into intellectual or conceptual thought. So I have the feeling that many analytic philosophers won't like this. Not because of any reason to think it's not true, but just because it makes art a phenomenon that at least partially escapes the kind of analysis that they're trained to apply to things. Often, I think the best that can be done with words and propositions is to describe or point to a work of art in a way that helps to guide others to be aware of and to take up for themselves the perspective that a work is expressing, that is helping to show how the parts of a work hang together. And in practice, I think this is what a lot of art criticism does. So that's a brief explanation of what I mean by perspective. When I propose to define art in terms of the expression and articulation of perspectives, but then the second part is what do I mean by expression? When I say that our works express or articulate these things that I'm calling perspectives. So the understanding of expression that I'm working with is what I alluded to earlier as the general post-romantic conception of expression, rather than the familiar 19th century romantic conception. So here it's not a matter of an artist having a feeling or thought, or some kind of inner mental state that's then pressed out from them into some external form. Instead, on the post-romantic understanding, what is expressed is brought into being, or etymologically pressed out from, the interaction between the artist, their medium, and the world more broadly. So for example, a painter making a portrait or a landscape or any kind of picture will be attending both to the materials they're working with and, if it's a picture depicting something, say the person posing for them or the scene that's lying in front of them. So their attention will shift back and forth between the medium and some part of the world outside the medium and the materials they're working with what the painter notices in their subject informing what they do with the materials of their medium, and we're registering the effects of something they've just done in their medium, how a line here or a color there changes the overall composition that's developing. Also informs what they will go on to do with the medium, as well as possibly informing how they attend to the subject in front of them. So this, I think, meets the desideratum that I mentioned earlier of defining art in terms of something that's created by artists. Since here the artist is causally responsible for bringing what is expressed into being. So if we think of what is expressed in terms of a perspective rather than just a feeling or an idea or some content, then This would imply that artists are actually creating the perspectives that their work are expressing. They would be creating or bringing into being new ways of experiencing, new ways of feeling about or understanding or seeing something. And since here what's expressed doesn't predate its expression, because, as I said, artists are, in some sense, literally creating this new way of experiencing something, it can't be known until it gets expressed, even by the artist. So there's a sense in which artists are both creating and discovering what they're expressing, discovering it by creating it, effectively. And if this time is something, the same thing can be both discovered and created by the same person in the same act. If this sounds paradoxical, I'd be happy to talk about it further in the Q&A after the lecture. Even though the artist doesn't know in advance precisely what he or she will express in making the work, which is to say they can't know exactly what they're making until they make it, or what the work will be until the work is finished. This isn't a blind or random process of the artist just sort of messing about aimlessly with their medium in the hope that something will emerge. Instead, it's very much a deliberate and guided process, with the artist attending closely to the results of each of her choices of what to do with her medium, both in relation to the other choices she's just made so far, like the lines she's already painted, and to the emergent whole that's coming into being, as well as the relation of this to any subject matter the work might have outside of itself. For instance, the relation of what's taking shape on canvas to the person sitting for their portrait. And with the artist attending to the various further possibilities that each creative choice and action opens up. So for example, a poet's initial choice of specific words in a certain order in one line might suggest new possibilities that they hadn't thought of until that moment for how the next line might be written. Maybe this is the possibility of an internal rhyme suddenly striking the poet, where they won't have been aware of and didn't have in mind the possibilities before the current line was written as it was. So on this account, the act of expressing occurs during the process of a work's creation, where the end of making the work and the final expression taking form coincide, they're one and the same. The finished work, then, being the result of all the artist's creative choices and actions, could be said to make concrete or embody the expression. And this allows an audience to apprehend the expression by attending to the work, to its concrete embodiment, just as the artist was aware of the expression by attending to the medium, as she was working with it in the process of creation. So in effect, there's an interpersonal interplay of attention going on here. Right? The artist attends to something in a certain way and registers or embodies that way of attending in the finished product that's made, with that finished product structuring the viewer's attention so that when they're looking at it, they're attending in a similar, though not strictly identical, way that the artist was attending to. So I think this is what it is for the work, not just to express, but to articulate or make manifest what it expresses, by allowing an audience to reenact the artist's intentional acts, and so come to take up for themselves the perspective that the artist came to develop and take towards something in the course of making the work. So it's important to note that defining art as the expression in a medium of a new perspective entails that a work merely having a perspective, or a work allowing an audience to take a perspective on something, won't be sufficient for that thing to count as an artwork. So pretty much everything allows a perspective to be taken on it. So that would make everything art. And anything that's about something in any way will have a perspective on that thing just in virtue of being about it. In the language of representation, which I usually prefer to avoid, we could say that anything that's a representation will have a way of representing what it represents, as well as some representational content. But not everything, and not even every representation, is plausibly a work of art. So what's necessary on this definition is that the work makes manifest and makes available for conscious apprehension and awareness this perspective. So the work, it's not a matter of a work of art just having or containing a perspective in some sense, but of expressing and articulating this perspective in the medium by how the artist used that medium. So I think this gives us a way of distinguishing art from other activities, such as science or history or philosophy, which can also articulate ideas, because they're not necessarily going to be expressing the ideas in the way that I explained expression, they're just going to be stating them. But if a piece of scientific or historical or philosophical writing articulates not just an idea, but also articulates or makes manifest or makes the reader aware of or attend to the way of thinking that idea that was involved in the writer thinking it, making the reader aware again not just of the idea, but of what it's like to think it, or the attention to the way it's written is part of what we might call getting the point, then I would say that such a piece of writing could count as art, in addition to counting as philosophy or science or whatever. And maybe a good case in philosophy to take here is the works of Wittgenstein. We might think that with the works of Wittgenstein, both the earlier Tractatus and then his later works, that attention to the way these works are written is part of the point that the works are making. It was not just something that in propositional form is being stated. The reader's attention is being drawn through the act of having to read these philosophical works in a certain way to something that Wittgenstein is trying to get across as the point of the works. So I think it also gives us a way to link late modern and postmodern artistic practices, including avant-garde and conceptual artworks, with more traditional art forms, since what a work takes a perspective on can also be, of course, the medium in which the work was made, and not only things that are external like landscapes or portrait sitters or whatever. So this gives a continuity to artistic practices and traditions, and it allows us to explain how something like a signed urinal or a monochrome canvas, like a canvas that's just painted a solid red or blue or whatever, or several minutes of silence in a concert hall, can count as art. Here, if and when they're art, it's not just because someone presented them as candidates for appreciation in a traditional artistic context, such as a gallery or a concert hall, but it's because the person's act of presenting them in this way expresses a perspective on the medium or art form, or on the art world and its practices. So finally, there's the novelty requirement, because part of the definition I want to have is that what is expressed or articulated is a new perspective. So this would entail that something counts as a work of art only if the perspective it expresses is at least somewhat new, at least partially or in some minimal way. So this would entail that when Duchamp's fountain was first produced, it might count as a work of art, assuming we take it to express something about the art world and its practices. But someone else doing the same thing, signing a urinal or some other similar piece of porcelain and putting it in a gallery, would not thereby be making a new artwork, unless it could be shown that the act of their doing this somehow expressed a new perspective on the original work. So I was trying to look it up and I couldn't find if this was actually an example, or it might have been a sort of hypothetical counterexample of something that sounds like Andy Warhol might have done, or if Andy Warhol actually did this. With the Robert Barry conceptual work, all the things I know, which I'm not currently thinking, and then giving a date. So again, I heard this, but I can't remember if someone said Andy Warhol actually did this, or was just proposing it as something Warhol might have done. But say, it doesn't really matter, my purpose. Say that another artist, not Robert Barry, wrote pretty much the same sentence, but changed it to all the things that Robert Barry knows, but of which he's not thinking. He gave the same date. I mean, it seems like, even though that would be the sort of thing that could easily be dismissed as like postmodern nonsense, or where the art world goes awry and people are just making things that have no value, I think that on my definition, that could plausibly count as an artwork, because that act is quite likely making a comment on or expressing a new perspective on what Robert Barry was doing, and maybe on the practices of, say, ownership of artworks in the art world. And similarly, I think this novelty requirement for the perspective would entail that a faithful performance of a musical score, where the score is an artwork that's made by the composer, but where the performer performs the score just in a purely faithful way that gives sort of almost what you can call it, a mechanical or unoriginal performance of the score. Right? The performer isn't adding anything new to what's on the page, what the composer did. There, I think there would only be one artwork the listener would be hearing, the artwork made by the composer and sort of presented to them through the performer. But another performer performing the score, where this performer performs it in a way that expresses a new perspective on it, perhaps by getting us to understand or hear the work in a new way. I think there would be two works of art going on, or two people that we could sort of attribute the work of art to. One is the composer, but then another would be the performer. I think this is what's going on with many of Glenn Gould's performances of Bach's music. So listening to those performances, we're hearing one artistic work that Bach composed, but I think we're also hearing what could be distinguished as a second work of art, in a sense. Glenn Gould's work of art in performing the score so as both to have, because it's not changing it wildly, so it's still the same piece Bach composed, but he's performing it in a way that is adding his own take on it. It's getting us to understand or hear the music in a different way. So to sum up all of what I've said, I think that this way of defining art and distinguishing artworks from things made or done in traditional art forms that are not art, in the way that, again, not every novel is a work of literary art, not every poem is a work of poetic art, and so on. I think it's plausible because it meets the desiderata I outlined at the start. Right, so the definition that makes artworks things that are essentially created by artists and things that can be experienced by audiences. Insofar as viewers, spectators, not only take up, but are made aware of the perspective or way of taking things that the artist created and expressed through their workings in a different medium. It gives an answer to the question, what makes something count as art? As the question might arise for practitioners and not merely for metaphysicians, since it gives a principled way of distinguishing between art and non-art within what are considered art forms. And it respects the open logic of the concept of art that Weitz insisted on, since novelty and creativity is built into the definition, so the definition doesn't sort of curtail it by imposing a too limiting set of necessary and sufficient conditions. And since the specifics of what perspective any work will express, or how its medium will be used, or even what the medium can be, these are all left open by the definition in ways that I think Weitz's point requires. And I think that it also means the other desiderata that I gave, which is that a work of art should be the sort of thing that at least could bear the kinds of value that we typically attribute to art. And I want to just conclude by saying, in keeping with the theme of the workshop, how art, as the expression of perspectives in the way that I've described, has cognitive value, or what gives art its cognitive value on this account also, I think, grounds the ways that art can be socially, politically, and even morally valuable. So by involving an artist making something that not only develops and articulates a new perspective, but also makes this perspective available for others to take up themselves, art on this account is not just a matter of expressing perspectives, but also sharing them. And I think it's this element of what I'm calling perspectival sharing that's at the heart of the distinctive values that art can have. So although this ultimately isn't separate from art as expressing perspectives, since to articulate something in a publicly available medium is in principle to make it available for others to grasp and understand. And in principle it does this even if no one else beside the artist in fact ever experiences a particular work. So I think that both the developing or creating and the sharing of new ways of experiencing things has obvious cognitive value. Or at least it's obvious as long as we don't think that having cognitive value can only be, or must be identical to, being a direct source of propositional knowledge. Which I think is the assumption that the people Aristotle as the skeptics or anti-cognitivists tend to assume. So I would argue that something can also have cognitive value by being the basis for knowledge without being knowledge itself. And this is the case for gaining a new way of experiencing something, which I think audiences do gain from a sort of robust engagement and a successful engagement with works of art. The audience comes not only to be aware of what the work is expressing, but comes to share it or develop a new way of finding things meaningful, a new way of experiencing things. We might think of this as what we could call knowing as. So for example, when you come to know more about a person by seeing different sides of their personality in different contexts, and so on. Right? Gaining more perspectives on something, similarly, gives you different ways that you know the thing as. And changing your perspective on something can, maybe always does, lead to a change in what you do know about it. And I think it also increases the range of what else you can come to know about it. So other than just learning facts, I think cognitive value includes the value of having what we might call a broader horizon, or having a wider, more complete, or again, what we might call a synoptic view of the different perspectives that one can take on a topic. And I think that all else being equal, this makes one better able to, or more likely to, come to have a better understanding of that thing, that topic, to know it more fully, in a sense, and likely to know it more accurately than someone with a narrower view, who is only aware of fewer aspects or dimensions of that topic. And by making and engaging with art, understood as the expression of one or more perspective, artists and audience members expand their horizons. I think they gain new capacities for experiencing things, so this gives them new capacities for future experience. Because the ways of taking things, or the perspectives that our works are expressing, are, in some sense, generalizable, or in some sense you could separate the way of taking something from the particular thing that's taken in that way in a particular artwork. So by an artwork, say, giving us a certain way of feeling towards something, like maybe a work of art isn't just expressing sadness, but is expressing a certain way of feeling sad about something. I think by coming to be aware of this, and by taking up that perspective in our engagement with the work, so in a sense we come to maybe not feel sad ourselves, but at least imagine what it would be to feel sad in that way. I think not only do we sort of experience that one particular feeling of sadness, but I think that gives us a new way in which we can feel sad about something. If again, in the work of art, the perspective that it's presenting is genuinely new, that it's not sort of relying on cliches of the medium to portray or give us a generic or cliche notion of sadness. So I think also by making and engaging with art, artists and audiences can come to gain knowledge even in that sort of traditional sense or factual sense, knowledge that. So for instance, they can gain, and I think artists obviously do gain, knowledge of the medium and what it can do or how it can be used. And the medium is part of the world. So even though that's probably not the main concern of epistemologists, I don't see why it shouldn't count as factual knowledge about something. And I would also go so far as to say that, at least in some cases, artists and audiences can come to gain factual knowledge about the subject matter of the work and not just its medium. So for instance, coming to know more of the visual properties of a particular object or landscape or person by paying close, perspicacious attention to it. In the way that, say, an artist who pays close attention and spends time drawing something, in a sense, sees it more fully, knows more details about it. You might say they know more about its appearance or visual properties than someone who just casually glances at it. So I'm probably running out of time. I did want to focus a bit more on the cognitive because of the nature of the workshop. So I'll just very quickly say something about how I think that this notion of perspectival sharing also gives art a kind of social or political value, and I think a moral value. So again, this is just going to be quick, but maybe it will get expanded on in the Q&A after lunch. So I think, in one sense, that the act of not just developing and expressing a perspective while making a work, but the artist's act of sharing a perspective with others is something that's inherently social. I think that making art is inherently, in principle, social. Even if someone is doing it in what we might call an antisocial way, someone writing something alone in their room or painting a picture and saying they're never going to show it to anyone, this is just for them. Maybe they're an icy teenager or whatnot. I think, again, in principle, by putting it into a medium, that medium is shareable or publicly available. Other people could come to see it, even if they in fact don't. So I think there is an inherent sociality, or sort of at least pointing towards some relation with another person that's inherent to the act of making art. And in terms of political value, I think just coming to share and get a sense of or understand other perspectives, even if one doesn't come to endorse them oneself, I think this can further things like empathy, mutual understanding, solidarity, and so forth, that are, like, you can easily see how these things would have political value. And just finally, to wrap up, so we can go to lunch, I think this same dimension or aspect of art also gives art a kind of moral value, because there are obviously, like these things that I mentioned, empathy, mutual understanding, solidarity, they have moral as well as political dimensions. And just, I think, the act of an artist making a work of art that will, in principle, expand their audience's horizons, will give the audience who engages with it not just new perspectives, but new capacities for future experience. I think this has a kind of moral value. It's sort of being generous with people. It's adding to, I said their capacities, but in, I think, the similar way that education is a morally valued act. The act of educating someone else, expanding what they know, giving them more knowledge, has a kind of moral value. It's making things better for that person in a way. So, yeah, I feel like I probably ran out of time. Maybe I didn't.
We should.
Yeah, we should wrap up. But I guess the conversation will continue after lunch in the Q&A, and that's part of the format.
Thank you so much.